So we're now recording, so I'll start again. This is Shannon McNeeley. I'm here at the North Central Climate Science Center at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. I'm the co-lead of the adaptation science area for the center, as well as the co-lead for the project we're about to talk about today. So I am presenting with my colleague and co-lead, Dr. Corrie Knapp, and we also have several grad students on the project who I believe at least two of the three are on the webinar as well, Trevor Evan here at CSU, and John Joya, who is at Western State Colorado University with Corrie. And so Corrie is an assistant professor of environment and sustainability at Western State, as well as the coordinator for the Master of Environmental Management and Integrative Care Management. And Corrie and I actually come from the same PhD program at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So we've known each other for a little while. So I will go ahead and get started. As many, if not all of you know, the mission of the North Central Climate Science Center is to provide science and decision support tools for climate change adaptation for the Department of Interior and tribal land and resource managers in our region. So this map shows those lands. Of particular interest for our talk today are the Bureau of Land Management lands, which are in kind of that orangey, rusty orangey color, assuming it's translating the same on the WebEx, and particularly in the state of Colorado, as you can see, most of which is on the west slope of the state. So the Department of Interior in recent years has directed the agencies and bureaus to start thinking about climate adaptation planning and integrating climate change science into planning and management efforts. So this project is part of that effort for the Colorado State BLM office and is a partnership between us here, the North Central Climate Science Center, Colorado State University, Western State, and the BLM state office. So within this sort of mandate, there's a need to understand both the impacts of climate change on public lands and the users of those public lands, as well as the impacts of those institutions, such as the Bureau of Land Management, and their adaptations to climate change on those populations, in other words, on the people who are the users of those. And so as such, Corrie and I were basically contracted by the State Bureau of Land Management office to conduct this social vulnerability assessment of the land users in Colorado through this partnership. So it's funded in part by the state Colorado Bureau of Land Management office, as well as leveraging funding through the North Central Climate Science Center. So here you just see a little bit more of a detailed map of BLM lands in Colorado. So statewide, there are 8.3 million surface acres that the Bureau of Land Management manages, and 27 million acres of subterranean mineral estate. So roughly 900,000 people live in census tracts that are adjacent to BLM lands. So not only does that indicate a lot of use of BLM lands in the state, but also economies that are dependent on BLM lands. So here's another map that you can see the various BLM field offices in the state. And we are, in particular, for this study, going to be focusing on the Little Snake Field Office here in the northwest region of Colorado, where I've done research prior to this study, as well as the Gunnison Field Office region here, where Corrie has done previous research. So there are a lot of ways to define and frame and assess vulnerability to climate change. And so I thought it was important for us to at least give you all our definitions of how we're defining vulnerability to climate change, particularly from a social perspective in which humans are explicitly included in the definitions. So exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity are the same as in ecosystem, except for in our case, again, we have human communities and looking at how the character, magnitude, and rate of changes from climate change to which a human community is exposed to climate stressors. Sensitivity being the degree to which a human community is susceptible to harm or likely to be affected by climate changes and or decision-making on public lands, the degree to which a human community depends on the provisioning of ecosystem services and thus sustainable resource management to support land-based livelihoods. And then adaptive capacity has to do with the ability of human communities to generate and apply new knowledge, make decisions, and act collectively in order to reduce those climate exposures and modify those sensitivities, thus reducing overall vulnerability, the prevalence of supportive and equitable decision-making processes in public land management. So our initial approach for how we are going to do the assessment is we start with the research questions. What is the current state of knowledge about the vulnerability of public land-dependent livelihoods in this region to climate change? And in part, to answer this question, we did a pretty comprehensive literature review, and that is in a paper that we've submitted to a journal. And what are local BLM offices doing currently in order to consider the vulnerability of public land-dependent livelihoods? What are the characteristics of dependence on public lands across the state, and that includes which counties are most economically dependent on public lands and on BLM lands in particular? What are the primary public land-dependent livelihoods in each county, and which counties will be most vulnerable to climate change in the context of BLM management decisions? We also asked how will those land-based livelihoods be affected by climate change in the context of those decisions, which includes how are user groups vulnerable to climate change and how do management decisions influence this vulnerability. So at this point, Corrie and I are tag teaming, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Corrie, to take it from here, and just let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay, thanks so much, Shannon. And thanks for everyone being here, too. It's fun to be talking about this project that we've been working on for a while and are very excited about. So I'm going to take us through the research strategies that we've used thus far, and we chose to adopt a really multi-pronged strategy to answer the research questions that we posed on the last slide. So I'm going to address each of those briefly here, and you could click through them, Shannon, right now. And I'll give you more information on each of these in some future slides, but our first step was a review paper of different methods for assessing social vulnerability on public lands, and we were really interested in understanding how social vulnerability has been expressed in these contexts before, and to assess what are the best practices, what have people learned by doing these assessments. And this provided us with a really nice baseline understanding about the best way to conduct social vulnerability assessments. And the review really made it clear that there are strengths and weaknesses to all of these different approaches to social vulnerability. And so in response, we really chose this suite of complementary strategies. So the next three are those complementary strategies. And the first one is the indicator-based statewide mapping. And for this, we were looking at trying to look at patterns of dependence on public lands across the state. Then we did a gray literature review to assess how the BLM is currently integrating climate change into their work. And the final step is going to be a series of case studies that will really look at social vulnerability in two specific field offices that Shannon mentioned earlier, the Gunnison and the Little Snake. And we've bounded the study to primarily include interviews with BLM staff and then people in land-based livelihoods, including recreation and ranching, as well as some interviews with tribal interests. So we can go to the next slide now. So for the review paper, we synthesized prior studies that had used various different social vulnerability assessment methods in the context of climate change. And the methods we reviewed included the ones that are listed here: indicator-based approaches, integrated assessment, scenario planning, and case studies. And for each, we really assessed their strengths and weaknesses in the context of public lands management. So for instance, while indicator approaches are really able to provide a broad assessment at a large scale, looking relatively at the amount of vulnerability, case studies are much better at uncovering really context-specific factors that lead to vulnerability. So through this review, we highlighted 3 different characteristics that we felt were critical for social vulnerability assessment, and these include participation by stakeholders, the importance of integrating information from different scales, and this attention to the interplay between institutions and actors. So those are kind of the primary arguments that we had about the model that we would like to see moving forward for social vulnerability in public lands management context. And the review paper was submitted in October of this year, the climate risk management, and it's currently under review. So we can go to the next one, Shannon. All right, so we've started to collect data and create some preliminary maps that will help to depict the dependence on BLM lands across the state. So for grazing dependence, which this map shows, we're looking at factors such as AUMs per permit, AUMs per field office, the ratio of public to private lands, and the number of allotments per field office. And then if you can click again, Shannon, for recreation dependence, we're looking at things like the number of special recreation permits and the number of event permits in each of those field offices. And we're also going to try to collect some other data on tribal consultations in each of the field offices. And we would like to also explore including some employment and economic statistics, but these have been a little bit tricky to disaggregate as they're not always categorized in ways that specifically fit our research questions. So what we're showing here really in these graphs is dependence on public lands, and this doesn't exactly get at vulnerability, but it does get at dependence, which is really related to a population sensitivity to BLM management decision making. So we're in the pretty early phases of developing these maps, but we're going to be in consultation with BLM employees and others to make sure that the indicators we're using are relevant and make sense to the BLM in terms of what the best stages are of dependence on public lands. All right, next one. So we've also undertaken a gray literature review, and this review is looking at how the BLM is currently integrating climate change into management planning. And so there's several ways that we're assessing this. We're looking at both current resource management plans as well as resource advisory committee meeting notes. And what we're trying to do, and we're also looking actually at the final EISs for each field offices that are affiliated with those RMPs. And we've gathered all of the RAC meeting notes from all 3 of their advisory committees for the past 5 years. And we're also looking at a few important drought years that preceded that period. And we've completed some preliminary coding to search for mentions of both the words climate change and drought. And since then, we've developed a much more comprehensive list of terms related to climate change, and we're going to use these terms to locate passages within those documents. As many of you know, these documents can be really long, and so we're trying to find ways to look for the passages where people are talking about these themes so that then we can code those passages in a qualitative data analysis software. And our intention in this process is really to understand how the BLM is currently dealing with climate change in their planning efforts. So we want to look at the frequency that the terms are used in, the context in which climate change is being discussed, and then also the ways that climate change is being discussed in those passages so that we can better understand how it's being integrated into their planning. All right, next slide. And our next step step is really to launch into a series of case studies, which will occur in the Gunnison and Little Snake field offices. And we're planning to interview BLM managers and scientists, and we're hoping to prioritize staff members who manage graze and recreation or tribal interactions and have been in the area long enough to really be familiar with climate variability. And the types of questions we're planning to ask are things about their job, observations of climate variability and change, how their management decisions are affected by climate variability, and how those decisions affect permit holders, and whether they have any flexibility within their institutional constraints in making these decisions. And then once we've completed this first set of interviews, which is really exciting, I think may start this week, the first set of interviews with the BLM employees will be about 5 to 7 per field office. And then we're going to reach out to public land users who are engaged with land-based livelihoods, such as ranchers and recreation-based businesses. And in that context, we're trying to prioritize users who have been in the area for a long amount of time so that they understand kind of trends and patterns that they've seen in weather-related events. We want people who have permits either for grazing or recreating on BLM lands. And we're also looking for folks that have been recommended by our first round of interviews with BLM staff. So in this round of interviews, we're going to be asking participants questions related to their business and their history in the area, the seasonality of their operation, their dependence on public lands, their observations of climate change and variability, and the risks that these events pose to them. And we also want to know how their permits currently function and how they might like to see them function in the future. And we plan, overall between BLM employees and these different user groups to conduct about 25 to 30 interviews per case study. And we're planning to audio record, transcribe them, code them in qualitative data analysis software. And we really hope that these more in-depth windows into local level vulnerability can complement that statewide assessment and the gray literature review to really help better understand the vulnerabilities of land-based livelihoods and how BLM decision-making may impact those vulnerabilities. So next slide. All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about the timeline. These are the 4 components that I just discussed, but we are in the first phase of project funding, and we've completed the literature review. We've begun to collect and synthesize data for that statewide indicators assessment, and we've compiled the information for the gray literature review and started to code those documents and plan for these case studies. And the case studies are really going to launch very soon this winter to the spring, and we hope to have an initial report of this preliminary findings from the first phase done by next winter, winter of 2016. And we are also planning a phase 2 for the project, and we've discussed the potential for expanding case studies or potentially hosting a synthesis meeting with the ecosystem vulnerability assessment team that's also working for the BLM right now to look at vulnerability of ecosystem components. And we are also interested in developing some decision support tools and outputs for climate change adaptation. So that is sort of in the planning for our second phase. And that was a pretty quick run through of everything, but that's the overview of where we are at this time and what we're doing. And we'd really like to answer your questions and also hear any comments you might have about the project.
Great, thanks, Corrie. And I just want to say a special thank you to the North Central Climate Science Center for supporting the project, and also to the state BLM office, and in particular Bruce Rittenhouse, who spearheaded this project and is quite forward-thinking for actually commissioning a social vulnerability assessment. I don't know if any other state BLM offices are doing something like this. I don't think they are, none that I know of. If anybody knows of any, let us know. We would love to know. Yeah, and I just also want to say, when we started talking about doing this assessment, when Bruce pulled a group together, gosh, how long ago was that? Maybe a year at this point, almost.
Yeah.
There were multiple other people who were involved in some of the early phone calls and meetings. We had a planning meeting here at the center, and the way things sort of shook out was it was decided that Corrie and I would co-lead this assessment, but that, you know, we recognize that there are a lot of you out there who have worked in this area of vulnerability on BLM lands, and we wanted to kind of re-engage that group, and hopefully I see a few who are on this webinar, so that we don't lose sight of that fact and we don't lose connection with those folks. Unfortunately, there's only a small amount of funding really to do this project, at least right now, maybe into the future. So, you know, unfortunately, we don't have funding at this moment, but we do want to make sure that we are, you know, communicating to the community, to all of you, that we welcome your input. We welcome if there are any resources or opportunities for engagement that you want to provide or let us know about. We really welcome that, and we hope that you will, you know, mention some of those things right now if it's appropriate, or contact us when the webinar is over. But I just wanted to make sure that I mention that, because, you know, we do want to stay in touch with other experts out there who either are currently doing or have done similar work that would help inform this assessment. So with that, I will open it up to the group. Are there any questions or comments?
This is Jeff Morse. I have a question. I don't know if you can go back to the slide that showed kind of the literature reviews and a three-way kind of pie chart of what you were suggesting in the publication.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you crosswalk the 4 bullet points on the left with the 3? So I'm more of an ecologist. I'm trying to understand the implications of each of the things on the left with what you guys are arguing for, and if there's a way, and maybe there's another way to state that question, but to help better understand what you're arguing for, you know, how does it relate to the 4 things on the left, and what are you trying to argue for? And then maybe we saw some of that with the maps and the interviews, and so maybe just a little bit more context of this approach. And Corrie, if you want to address that.
Yeah, do any of you guys want to address that? I mean, John Joy is the lead author on the paper, so John, I don't want to put you on the spot, but
you're the lead.
You're the lead author, so I'm going to go ahead and put you on the spot.
I want to steal your thunder.
Are you on, John? Are you muted?
I'm sorry. Can everyone hear me now?
Yep.
I was muted before, so I had to fix that. So, Jeff, let me see if I can answer your question here. And so the bullet points on the left there, for that we were looking at previous approaches to assessing social vulnerability, and those were the 4 approaches that we focused on. And as Corrie explained, from that we kind of saw strengths and weaknesses associated with each approach in the context of doing a social vulnerability assessment for public lands management. And those strengths and weaknesses kind of led us to this framework over there on the right side that connects what we thought would be the most important aspects of a social vulnerability assessment for public land management, which would be focusing on those institution-actor relationships, stakeholder participation, and the integration of information from different scales. So it was kind of the information on the right there is kind of following this synthesis of the analysis of the factors on the left. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of a new approach, maybe synthesizing from the 4 techniques, I guess. That's a fair way for me to try to describe it.
I was going to jump in and just say that, you know, all of those, when John did this, you know, review of all of these different approaches, those strengths and weaknesses, it's not like a correspondence between any one of those methods and one of the things that we are arguing over here. We're kind of arguing that, you know, a combination of some of those approaches that have come before is necessary in order to really dive into each of those three factors that we think is important. For instance, if you were just doing case studies, you wouldn't have necessarily the top-down and bottom-up data, and that is really looking at, you know, what kind of information can you get at different scales of analysis. So that's more suggesting the combination of an indicators-based approach with case studies.
That's helpful. Both of you, thanks.
Hi, this is Keith in Denver. I work for the BLM as a recreation planner. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about why you selected the number of SRPs and the number of events. I think you chose those two to represent the existing recreation use.
Were you talking about the literature review or the indicators map?
The indicators map. Right, so I think what you're telling us is you chose the number of outfitter and guide permits that were issued and the number of special events like a running race or a horse race or a off-highway vehicle race as the metrics, correct?
Yes, and at this point, I'll just jump in and say something, but Shannon and John, please add to what I have to say. So at this point, we were looking at the available data that was, you know, really available that we could get for each field office. And those were data that were fairly easy to compile and collect for each field office. We, at this point, realized that that's not probably enough to really get at the recreation and the dependence on recreation on BLM lands. And so our next step is actually going to be to take kind of the indicators that we've developed so far and run them by a set of people from the BLM. And I would love to hear your advice about what other types of indicators you think would be useful to look at. We could really use that type of advice at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll have to think about that. But just so I understand, it was you chose those two because that was the available data.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, that's right. And I was just going to say, Keith, and for everyone, you know, that we probably should have prefaced it by saying we view these as just sort of initial drafts. And, you know, this isn't our ultimate product of what we want to put out there. This was just a first cut at looking at, you know, what data is out there, how can we start to think about dependence, but we absolutely want to get input from folks like you and in the field offices to help enrich our understanding of dependence and add other data sets or maybe collect other data if that's necessary to get a deeper understanding. So we, like Corrie said, we definitely would love to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, thanks. And I appreciate that openness because that is my initial concern is I'm not sure there are any easily accessible indicators where there's lots of data available. That is a constant challenge.
Yeah.
Right, which again is why we're arguing for this more sort of holistic approach for understanding these issues, which include, you know, interviews and case studies and really getting that local knowledge and the knowledge from folks like you at the state office about, you know, how else can we, whether it's qualitatively or quantitatively, probably it'll be some combination, really, you know, flesh out that understanding. So.
Hello, this is Renee, and I've got a question for you all. How are you?
Good.
Good. Thanks for the presentation. Hey, I'm wondering if you've given any thought to some economic indicators, and I don't have a really good idea on how you would do this, but when I look at this and you've got ranching and recreation, I'm just wondering if there's some kind of a comparison or putting it into context of the economy, say for the county, whether that's Moffett County or Gunnison County, and the importance of that activity to the overall economy of that region or county, something like that. I'm not sure I'm getting it right, but I'm just wondering if there's a economic way of indicating the importance of these public lands to the community economy.
Hi, this is Trevor Even. I'm here at the North Central Center, and I actually have I'm working on this and have been looking for a lot of economic data, particularly in the context of ranching and the way that one of the things I've noticed looking at the USDA Census of Agriculture, as well as some of their mapping products and different sort of county profiles, is that as you move across the state, you have very different sort of distributions of the size of farms and ranches within each county. So that's something that we're looking at in terms of how much does the local, say, ranching community or agricultural community, rely on public lands, both for grazing, but also for, the various ecosystem services they provide. And so looking at the county level and then maybe also drilling down to the specific small towns is something I've been interested in as well within the field office areas. So yes, we are looking, but economic data for low population rural communities is a very interesting literature to try to dig through. A lot of information is not reliable. A lot of it's out of date, and that's our kind of our challenge. But yes, we are really trying to incorporate that sort of like county field office level economic data to characterize, what do these public lands mean to the actual people and their ways of life and how they make a living in the different field office areas. So I don't know, does that answer your question?
Yeah, that helps. I can see how it would be challenging to come up with that kind of information, but I also think it would be very useful. I have another question on the adaptive capacity that you talked about in the first couple slides. And when we talk about adaptive capacity, you're talking about adaptive capacity of the human communities to more or less adapt to what's the climate exposures. But I didn't hear anything on how you get at that per se.
How we'll understand adaptive capacity?
Yeah. How do you score, or how do you come up with adaptive capacity? I mean, I see the definition in here, but I'm not quite sure I understand how you're going to get at it.
Right. Well, in part, it's going to come through the interviews. We have questions in our questionnaire about adaptive capacity, and that's really going to be determined largely by how those questions are answered, in a sort of grounded theory approach where we're not predetermining what adaptive capacities are, but rather we frame the questions in a way to get at adaptive capacity. And we didn't include our questionnaire in here. We probably should have done that. I could probably pull it up really quickly if you were interested, but yeah, well, this isn't the, yeah, we have two sets of questions, because we're starting out with the questions of the managers themselves at the field offices, and then we're actually still kind of in the process of finalizing our set of questions for the quote-unquote users. So in other words, the ranchers and the recreation sector folks and the tribal folks. But the evolution of those questions will occur as we get into the assessment of the initial round of questions with the managers.
And I'll jump in too. I think that sometimes adaptive capacity you can gauge through interview questions that ask about how people have adapted to things in the past or what they're thinking about doing for the future, sort of the ideas and creativity and innovation that they show within interviews. And I think another place that we'll get at that is looking at sort of these institutional constraints or barriers to adaptation. And I think that can inhibit your adaptive capacity if there are structures in place that make it much harder to adapt. And so I think that, in the interviews is definitely where we'll get at this question, that there's a lot of different factors that go into adaptive capacity. And like Shannon's saying, when we're going through and looking at the responses to those, applying kind of grounded theory plus, some knowledge of the literature of what those sort of core traits of adaptive capacity are, so that when we're coding those sections, we can really pay attention to the specific, pieces of it that contribute to adaptive capacity.
Thanks. Did you mention the time frame that is it a 2050 time frame? Sure.
Yeah, it's at the end there. We're hoping to have the interview and our initial analysis on this first phase done by next winter. So here you can see this winter we're starting interviews, analyzing interviews spring and summer, and then hoping to have preliminary results next winter.
Yes, sorry, I wasn't very clear. When you're thinking about exposure to climate change, is that exposure for a 2050 time frame, or is it 5 years into the future, 10 years, or is it kind of unknown? Just how do you, for exposure, when we look at ecological systems, we say, think about what we think the ecological systems will be experiencing by the year 2050. And I'm just wondering if you're doing something similar.
So again, Renee, the initial phase anyways, we're starting from this sort of bottom-up understanding exposure from their perspective and from their experience with climate stressors. I think, what we're thinking about for the phase 2 round, and it might even need to come sooner, is looking at the kind of exposures that you guys were looking at for the ecosystems vulnerability assessment. And I think, we've discussed separately in various meetings that we need to do some kind of a synthesis, and we talked about building that into the next round of funding to sit down with you guys and look at, what kind of exposures were you looking at in the ecosystems vulnerability assessment versus what we're learning from the managers and the users on the ground, and how do we synthesize that information to have a broader understanding of exposure. So it's still in some ways to be determined in terms of the sort of broader time horizons, but I can almost guarantee you we're probably not going to be looking at 2050. Probably much shorter time scales. But we certainly want to include the projections at some point in this assessment. So I don't know. I welcome your input, or if anybody else is on the line who's involved in the ecosystems vulnerability assessment, including Bruce or anybody else, about ideas about how we might do that synthesis work. I know you guys we're on different time scales because you guys started before we did, and you're sort of coming to the end of your assessment, and I think it's in question about what the next steps are. But I think, there's no time like the present to start having that discussion.
Yep. This is Jill, Colorado Natural Heritage Program, and this is going back, not to do with the timeline, but earlier talking about how you were determining societal importance of BLM lands, and have you considered at all energy development? Because that occurs quite a lot on BLM land, as you know, and I think it would be good if you could roll that in to what you're doing somehow.
Yeah, so that's a great question, Jill. You know, we have talked about it. Obviously, that is a big sectoral importance for BLM and talking about climate change. We made the decision for this first round, for this first phase, to focus on ranching, recreation, and tribal cultural uses. So we kind of tabled the energy sector for now, but it's certainly in the draft discussion for what we might do for phase 2. Did you want to say something?
Oh, and this is Trevor again. And I also wanted to mention it's relatively impossible to ignore energy when you're talking about contextualizing the importance of land-based livelihoods like ranching, recreation, and tourism, because in many places in western Colorado, the energy sector is a major employer. So we're factoring it in on that level as context, but yeah, like Shannon said, not going into the particular dynamics of it in this phase, maybe later.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, it would be ideal. There's only so much we can do, you know. So energy starts to get trickier just from a social perspective in terms of how, you know, A, the political sensitivity of it sort of goes up exponentially, and B, depending which part of the energy sector we were going to look at, ideally we're looking at, you know, across the spectrum of energy, but certain types of energy start to get a lot harder in terms of the people that you can talk to. In other words, you know, they don't live in the area, they're in headquarters offices in Denver or wherever farther away. Data can be a lot harder to get at because it's proprietary, et cetera. So that, you know, that was among our reasons for deciding that we weren't going to explicitly deal with energy, at least in this initial phase.
Okay, good. Yeah, thank you.
So, hi, this is Rob Winthrop at BLM Socioeconomics Program in Washington. Just wanted to add a few comments. First, Shannon and Corrie, it's great to see this moving forward to the point that it has after, you know, discussion a year ago or wherever it was when you started. Specifically, 2 points. We had the discussion about 10 minutes ago or so about economic indicators and the challenge of finding those. I'm not sure how much your team has been working with some of our economists and other social science staff at BLM, but we've got Josh Seaton and Jess Montag are both on this webinar, and Martin Hensley also from Colorado State Office. So they work a lot with trying to interpret data and make economic data and demographic data to make it applicable to telling a story about BLM, so there may be some help we can provide there. The other comment I wanted to make is back at this question of a grounded theory approach to asking people about adaptation and so forth, and I get it, that makes lots of sense, and as a cultural anthropologist, I'm on board in principle, but I would just also, and I'm sure you guys have thought about this a lot, there's a tension between trying to develop an approach to anything, including climate change adaptation, that is driven by the perspectives of the communities you're interviewing, and developing and having a framework that is going to be to some degree comparable across cases. And I hope we will be doing more studies like this, and we certainly need to be, whether BLM does or not, and I suspect we will, we need to be able to compare to the extent possible what you guys have found with what other studies have found. So it would be really helpful if, as part of the discussion of adaptation, you have at least some recommendations on relatively robust indicators or a framework that would be comparable across cases.
Yeah, thanks for your comments, Rob, and thanks for joining us today. Great points, and in answer to your first question, we have had those folks in some of the earlier conversations. Martin has been at a couple of our meetings. I believe Josh and Jess have been in some things here and there, calls maybe, and again, we absolutely would love to have them involved. We welcome their input. We welcome ideas about how to do that, how to communicate, and how to work together on this. You know, we don't really have a sense of at this point of what their availability is, but again, open it up to them. And if anybody, and I see a couple of you are on now, feel free to jump in. And to your second point, yeah, that's a great point, and I think that that's one of the things we're hoping that we're going to do probably again in the second phase, is to, one of the things we've talked about is actually putting together some kind of a report on the methodology and some kind of a, lessons learned, best practices, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely something we've thought about and really appreciate you emphasizing the need for that.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Shannon, this is Bruce. I think this has been great that we've got some comments here. I think I want to kind of go back to the adaptive capacity component. I see, and to Renee's question, one is I see two parts of the adaptive capacity. One is the human, the stakeholders and human community side of things, and then I also see the BLM's adaptive capacity. And you said some, I think it may have been you, Corrie, that said institutional barriers. And I think, the public can probably adapt faster than the Bureau can. So, but that's just kind of one concept there. And I think, a lot of this discussion recently about including energy development and time frames, I think that's really good stuff. And I think, most of this has been contingent on, as with most projects, the amount of funding available. So that's been one of our constraints. So, and not including some of the other key sectors. So just a couple comments.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Those are great comments, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there is the adaptive capacity of the managers themselves, and then the adaptive capacity of the users. And frankly, as you said, sometimes the time scales and the constraints are different, and the barriers. And also, I think, the elephant in the room too is that oftentimes they're at odds with each other. And this is what I think is going to be an interesting aspect of looking at the ecosystems vulnerability assessment and thinking about the synthesis work, because, if you're looking at, say, an endangered species, for example, and the adaptive capacity of that endangered species, sometimes that might be in conflict with something that the managers want to do or something that the users want to do. So, these are some of the kind of stickier issues that I think we need to have a good discussion about how we want to address that in the context of, the sort of official assessment and how that then influences BLM decisions about climate change adaptation. So,
if I could just add, this is Jeff Morset, kind of wearing the hat of the CSC director and thinking about my fellow directors, who most of us, or quite a few of us, believe in the social dimensions that need to be brought into bear if you're going to make it actionable science. So I think there would be some interest if we think about how this generalizes to other areas, or how it generalizes to what BLM is trying to accomplish. And I think that there's so few of it out there, so little of it out there, relative to the National Conservation Training Center has the Scanning the Conservation Horizons sort of essentially textbook, and have taught 1,500 or more students how to do a vulnerability assessment from the ecological side. We don't have that equivalent on the social side. So maybe something for us to collectively keep in mind is how we make this not just a case study, but sort of an example. Maybe there's others doing it in parallel, and what generalizes to sort of be the model for how this unfolds, so that I think that I guess as Rob was saying, how do we get some consistency across across these others that are going on. So I'm not even aware of the others that are going on. So maybe that's the first step. Maybe we have some sort of, occasional call with others who are doing it to compare notes. And then I can't speak for fellow CSC directors, but I imagine they would be very interested to have, say, a webinar that what BLM is interested in doing on the social dimension side of this type of analysis and how it goes forward.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff, and thanks a lot for saying that. The support and the identification of the need is really helpful. As Bruce said, there's, a lot of this is dependent on the resources, and part of the reason that there isn't this type of thing from a social perspective is that the funding and the support for, the biophysical sciences exponentially dwarfs any support for the social sciences. So, we would love to do this, but it's going to take some funding to do that. So.
Well, and I wonder if, like, the USDA or some of the other pots of money might be worth exploring outside the Department of Interior, because I think they dwarf what we have for ecology.
Right.
So, ag or grazing or something like that, maybe it's worth kind of brainstorming on.
Sure, yeah, good point.
One thing to add to that, too, is I feel like, there's often not the funding for the social science component of it, but there's oftentimes also not the funding for the integration of the ecological and the social vulnerability, and that's something that I think, Shannon and I are both very interested in, and something that we would like to see happen in the sort of second phase of it. But I could see the value in, trying to set up a meeting relatively soon with the ecological vulnerability assessment team, just to sort of crosswalk and understand the scale at which the assessments are being done, to see whether there are opportunities there for intersection. And I'd hate to get too far along in the process and then, realize that we're doing it at very different scales. So that could be a good thing, too.
Yeah, I agree, Corrie. And in fact, while we have Bruce and Renee and Jill and whoever else on the phone, can you guys maybe just give us a little bit of an update of where you are with the ecosystems vulnerability assessment, and if and when we might be able to start planning that, initial discussion about the synthesis?
Next Monday.
Yeah, next Monday, exactly. Yes.
It's on the calendar. I think I'm booked already, but no, sorry.
We've I'm sure there's somebody else on the phone from CNHP that could do this as well as me, but we have the draft out there, and it's a final draft, and the scale that we're working at is a statewide scale, so it is in some ways different than the scale you're working at, but I'm not sure it makes a big difference when I think about it. And we are looking at 2050, and we are looking at an RCP of 8.5 as well. So there may be some discrepancies, not just at scale, but at the uncertainty, if you will. However, the information that I think we have will be definitely of interest as to which ecosystems are vulnerable to exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So the same things you're looking at, and connecting where that's either recreation or ranching or economics, any other indicators that you come up with. If there's some overlap between ecosystems, the thing that I think may be the issue is that we have a tendency to be looking at ecosystem vulnerability, and in some ways what you're looking at is a landscape vulnerability as much as anything. And so ranchers may end up using sagebrush at part of their summer and then move up into, say, aspen part of the summer. So they're using multiple ecosystems. So then you have to look at multiple ecosystems. So you're looking at a landscape. Anyway, there's some mixing and matching that I think makes it quite interesting. And that, I think, will have to be the part of the creative part is how do we how do we look at a landscape and not just one ecosystem.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point, Renee.
So you guys laughed and said Monday, but really, what is the timeline, and when do you anticipate we might be able to start having those conversations?
Well, the reason I said Monday, Shannon, is that, you know, I'm meeting with you Monday morning, and
right.
since they're right across the hall or across the street from you at CSU, I thought I would talk with them, and maybe we've got 3 hours, so we could possibly talk about that as well. So
okay.
That's probably stuff for more offline, you know. But so I, you know, regarding the status of the vulnerability stuff for the natural resources side, I consider that pretty much final. Renee said a final draft. I consider pretty much final, and we're sending out a link to our field offices and saying that this information is now available for them to use.
Okay.
You know, it might be worth giving a webinar such as this on the results of that. I don't know.
We'll talk about that Monday. I've spurred
okay.
this has spurred some thoughts in my head, which is always dangerous. So.
And I would
right.
you know, ask you guys to think about the national office, the NICWISC as seminar series. Maybe think of it as a national seminar, webinar to talk about if you kind of maybe a combined and how it rolls up to BLM, you know, with you know, maybe that BLM perspective and then the 2 projects as something that could be
Yeah,
informative.
it's a good idea.
Bruce and Shannon, this is Karen. Michelle and I are both on, and I think we're open on Monday afternoon, so we really can meet then if you have time.
Monday afternoon. Bruce is going to be here in the morning.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be all morning that we need to talk, but I think if we got together that, I mean, you have till noon, I think. We had 9 to 12, so I think we can build some of this stuff in at the time. And so I'm looking at, and that was a good idea, Jeff, about the national webinar. I mean, some of the notes I jotted down by myself would be, is to one, give this similar presentation and maybe a combination of both the natural resource and the social side, human dimension side, to the Washington office. One, from a standpoint, and I know Rob is on, but I mean, you know, I'm thinking folks like Kit Muller and some of the folks, and you know, we briefed our state director on the climate change work we're doing with the natural resources and social, and our state director was very impressed by that work and actually wanted to provide a briefing to the director for this as well. So at least in a context of probably not getting into the details of both of these projects, but giving a short, you know, half-hour briefing to the director on our climate change adaptation work. So I felt that very encouraging.
Yeah, very cool, Bruce. So I would love to have a meeting with the ecological vulnerability folks, but there's no way that I could do that next Monday. So it would be cool if we could think about, and we can do this offline, but maybe sometime between the holidays or after the winter holidays. I know that you guys are done with yours now, but it might be helpful for us to think about sort of how yours was structured and how this one might interface, like Renee was saying, thinking creatively about how you connect sort of landscape with ecosystem.
Yeah, and next Monday I don't foresee us making final decisions. I mean, it's just more of a discussion, and
yeah, well, and that would be great.
Yeah,
if you
definitely.
Guys did that.
So cool.
Nice.
Totally.
Oh, that was fast. Okay, next Monday. Yeah, and if there's anything I can do to make sure that the people at NICWISC know about when they want to do a seminar for that. It's Holly Padgett kind of helps to arrange them, so we've got the contacts, I think, between.
Might be, yeah, it might be, at least for us, I don't know. You guys tell me what you think, but it might be a little early.
I think it is. I think But
once we, maybe once we get through our sort of first round of interviews,
I think so,
that
and
leads,
maybe even results of that, and then the ecosystem vulnerability is kind of done, and make sure they're polished to present. I like the idea of both, the ecological, because then you can compare and contrast. You go, okay, they should go on kind of hand in hand, and you should do both.
Right.
It'd be a good story to tell.
Right.
I'd rather be patient, have a good story, than put something fast.
Right, and they didn't exactly go hand in hand.
Right.
We'd have to be honest about that, but we're trying to hold hands, I think, as best as we can. So.
But doing that should be, you should think about both of them.
Right.
If you're funding vulnerability. So it's not that they have to be integrated at the project level, but that you should think about, if you're doing vulnerabilities, it's not just the fish and wildlife, it's the people that are using them.
Right. Yes.
That should help.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, did anyone else, we're at the hour now, but I don't, want to cut it off if anybody else has, I see some good people on there that still haven't spoken. Does anyone else have?
They come out, they forgot to turn on the computer.
All right, now my hand. Bill, Jessica, Lisa, anybody? I see you.
I'm good. I don't need to say anything.
Come on, you never don't say anything, Lisa.
Oh, that's not true. I'm just a lurker today.
Yeah, I'm lurking here too. That was very, very useful. How about what are you learning from Headwaters Economics? Did that get mentioned? I had a few interruptions. The work that Ray Rasker is doing on the economic value of the public lands. I just wanted to mention it. It probably got mentioned, and I had a couple of students drop by, so excuse me. But I appreciated the seminar.
No, it didn't get mentioned. I appreciate you mentioning that. We mentioned the possibility of including some economic indicators. We didn't specifically say anything about Headwaters, and to be honest, we as a project team haven't looked at that yet, I don't think, or maybe Trevor has. I lied, Trevor has.
Yeah, well, great, and I did listen to that part, and what he had, they had a contract with BLM years ago, and they developed a spreadsheet tool, and I think they've got it running on their website. But it may not be all that up to date, and no BLMer mentioned it. But let's look at it. I'd like to look at it too. I'll tell you what, Adam and I need to look at it for other stuff, and we'll tell you what we think. And it's just Headwaters Economics, all one word, .org, I think. But anyhow, thanks a lot for the webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, for that suggestion.
Yeah, good to talk with you, Corrie.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill. Trevor has looked at it.
Yeah, I was just going to say I'm actually looking at it right now, and
I bet you are.
Yeah, and it's really that issue of you can tell what the average income is, but looking at the real spread and what that community functions as is kind of more the level we want to get at. I mean, my interest is really, how do these different communities actually function as people like them to? And what is the role that they actually
all the time. I mean, I've seen, NRSs, and I saw.
I think someone else is talking on a different conversation. No, I hear you, and I know you mentioned, especially for the more deeply rural places. And gee, okay, maybe someone just mentioned ARS and their attempt to create a more finer distinctions of rural economies. I think I just.
ARS. So yeah, we're looking at. Oh, go ahead.
No, I don't have anything else to offer. Just thought I'd mention that. That's all.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks for the webinar.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. And please, if there are things that you want to suggest to Shannon or I, please shoot us an email. And, if you have any thoughts about how we could, improve anything that we're doing or shift something or another resource like Bill just mentioned, please do that because we could really use your insight and knowledge.
Yeah, I see. I just want to give one last call out. I see Jessica, you're still on. Did you have any thoughts or any interest in continuing the?
Oh, I have. This is Jessica. I definitely. Can you hear me?
I can. Yeah.
Okay. I definitely have interest in continuing, and I know Martin does as well. He was unable to make this presentation. And when it comes to the economics data, I have slews of information for you, how we approach it within as well as I'd be curious as to
It's a little hard to hear you, Jessica. I think someone's not muted. Is that Bruce?
How about now?
Yeah, if you
well,
have muted, that would help.
I've heard that before.
Oh, I hear that too now.
Yeah, it's bad.
Okay.
But long story short, yes, I'm more than happy to talk with you guys, and I know Martin would be as well in terms of some of the economics data, and especially linking either recreation and ranching to BLM and BLM lands and how we do it in our impact analyses and all of that to see if we can provide some sort of consistent mechanism for measuring some of these things.
That would be great.
So, most definitely.
Yeah, that would be great. Do you have any suggestions on, should we just maybe follow up and try and coordinate like maybe a conference call with you and Martin and maybe some other folks?
I think that, or a meeting in person where we can talk through some of the data sources, the economic data sources, I think could be valuable. There's a lot of, as with any data sources, there's a lot of benefits and challenges with the different data sources, all of which are appropriate, but they all have different assumptions built into them, and their methodologies are different. So having an understanding about one data source over another is helpful.
Good. Yeah, thanks for being willing to do that.
And what I'm thinking is maybe we would do like an initial conference call just to plan and then follow up with doing an in-person meeting sometime, maybe
that would work.
After the holidays in the spring, and maybe even let some of the interviews happen first and start getting some input from the field office managers. I'm just thinking out loud, like timing-wise, like how we might, and I'm open to your guys' suggestions about how we might sequence things in relation to having that discussion and getting more of that data.
I think it can work while you're doing those interviews. I don't see it as, I mean, as soon as we can or as soon as you might want that help, we're able to hopefully provide it. So it's just a matter of finding times and dates.
Okay. That sounds good. We'll definitely follow up and get that coordinated. And thank you so much for being on and for expressing your interest and your willingness to work with us. Really appreciate it.
Well, this is very exciting stuff. I'm excited about it. So
good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jess.
Great. Well, I guess with that, if there's any last thoughts, jump in now. Otherwise, going once, going twice. That's it, folks. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time and all of your input, and we look forward to continuing the dialogue with everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.